Hello, class. I'm back to pick up with lecture number 5 for History 101. When we left off last time, we were talking about the Intolerable Acts, the colonial reaction to those at the First Continental Congress, the all-out boycott that then ensued. So we want to pick up from there, and what we want to talk about next is things will really start to heat up in 1775. One thing that the British is going to do, which is both symbolic and strategic, they are going to put out a call for 30,000 mercenaries. Now, one thing I want you to understand, if you haven't been exposed to this before, you can really look at the American Revolution as a civil war. There were colonists who were loyal to the British Crown. They were known as loyalists or Tories. They wanted nothing to do with the revolution. They thought the Sons of Liberty were a bunch of crackpot rebels. And then, of course, there were diehard rebels. And there were also people sort of sitting on the fence in between. Now, when the British makes this call out for 30,000 mercenaries that they want to hire from another country, they're doing this for a couple of purposes. They realize this is a civil war, and if this does turn into outright war, it's going to be Brit versus Brit. And they're really becoming concerned about how some of these British redcoats will fight when they're asked to kill perhaps their relatives, their brothers, their cousins, sort of like the Civil War that happened later on in the United States. So they put a call out for 30,000 mercenaries, which are hired soldiers. And back in this day and age in Europe, there were dukes and so forth in different countries that had armies at their disposal. And the country that won the bid was Germany. So the British are going to hire 30,000 British mercenaries to come to the colonies to fight side by side, potentially. They don't know it's going to be a war yet. And these mercenaries are sometimes, and you'll read about them in the book, they're mentioned in this fashion also. They're known as Hessians. They're German mercenaries. And they start arriving in the colonies to instill fear in the colonists because they know these German mercenaries mean business. So that's one thing that the Brits do in response to this all-out boycott. Now, what is going to happen next, though, as far as how this starts to materialize into the Revolutionary War, the first battle of the Revolutionary War will happen on April 19th, 1775, outside of Boston, in the small, what are suburbs of Boston now, of Lexington and Concord. They were just villages back then outside of Boston, to the northwest of Boston, if you're familiar with the region. Now, what happens here is there were a sizable group of the Sons of Liberty who were arming themselves. They were acting like a military. They were training and so forth outside of Boston. General Gage, the military governor of Massachusetts, catches wind of this. So he decides to send some British troops out to Lexington and Concord to investigate what was really going on. So this is the famous incident when Paul Revere, who was a silversmith in Boston and a Son of Liberty, will make his famous midnight ride out to Lexington and Concord when he catches wind of these troops that are going to go out there the next day and warn his comrades, the Sons of Liberty, that as you already know, the British are coming. The British are coming. So the Minutemen, as they become known, are ready for the British when they arrive out in Lexington and Concord. a battle ensues, which is the very first battle of the American Revolution. The battle basically is fought to a draw. I don't know if any of you have been to the national park out at Lexington and Concord, but they've done a very good job of preserving the battlefield. The bridge that was the centerpiece of the battle is well preserved. It's a really neat spot to go to if you're in the Boston area. This battle ends in a draw, but to the Sons of Liberty, these rebels, that's a victory to them. They're a ragtag bunch that's in the process of training. They fought the most powerful army in the world at that point, and they repelled them. The British marched back to Boston. They didn't occupy Lexington and Concord. They didn't win the battle. It was a draw. So this really inspires the revolutionaries that, hey, maybe we do have a chance to stand up to the mighty British Army. Now that all happens on April 19th. The next thing that happens, the second real battle of the American Revolution, takes place on May 7th, 1775. That's when Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold, a person we're going to be talking quite a bit about here in these future lectures, will put together a force mainly of the Green Mountain Boys from what will become the state of Vermont, and they will capture Fort Ticonderoga. They'll do this in the middle of the night on May 7th. It's a sneak attack. Fort Ty is very lightly defended. There's less than 50 British troops there because they hadn't anticipated any kind of attack. Remember, the real enemy of the British had been expelled from the continent, the French. So, Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold, who was authorized by the Continental Congress to go there and raise troops to do this, will do so on May 7th, 1775. And they'll basically capture Fort Ty without firing a shot. The British will surrender. The next day, a group led by Seth Warner, one of the Green Mountain Boys, who will become a very integral part of the American Revolution, will go north to the fort at Crown Point, which is a British fort, and capture that also. The very important and significant part of capturing these two forts are the more than 70 cannon that the rebels lay their hands on. The following winter, all those cannon will be transported to Boston by General Henry Knox, one of Washington's most trusted generals, to defend Boston the next year. But that wouldn't have been possible without the capture of Fort Ticonderoga and Crown Point in May of 1775. So, next what's going to happen in May of 1775, the Second Continental Congress will meet. At this particular meeting, one person will dominate the meeting. That's George Washington. Now, he comes to this meeting knowing that two very significant events had just taken place, Lexington and Concord and the capture of Fort Ticonderoga and Crown Point. And what he will do is convince the Continental Congress that if we are really serious about fighting a war against the British, that we have to do a couple of things. We have to create a full-time army, because at the time the thought was we could depend upon colonial militias to fight the British. But George Washington, who had received his first military experience as an officer in the French and Indian War, he was one of those colonists who were trained by the British, knew militias were too unreliable. They're sort of like ragtag National Guard units that were all farmers. And when the spring came, these militia groups all returned home to plant their crops, because if they didn't, their families would starve. In the fall, the militia groups all left the battlefield to go and harvest their crops. Washington knew this from his relationship with colonial militias during the French and Indian War. So he argued the only way we're going to be able to pull this off, and it looks like it's going to be an impossible task as is to create a full-time professionally trained army. Now, that's a gigantic step forward for the rebellion, because to do that, that meant they needed a lot of money. So what the Continental Congress will do at its second meeting is they will agree with George Washington. They will establish the Continental Army, a full-time professionally trained army, and they'll pay for it by issuing Revolutionary War bonds, which were very risky things for colonists to buy, but it was a way for rebels to support the cause. They took the revenue from the sale of these bonds to fund the military. Once they took those two steps, they offered command of the Continental Army to George Washington, and he accepted command of the Continental Army. These are significant steps forward, but as you'll no doubt realize, one thing we didn't do at the Second Continental Congress in May of 1775 is we did not declare our independence. We weren't ready to do that yet. What had to happen first is we had to get enough support colonial-wide for the rebellion. And we were a torn group of colonies at this point. Plenty of loyalists, plenty of rebels, plenty of people who today we would call undecided voters, basically. So, in order to really rally the support, in order to set up declaring independence in July of 76, a very important essay is written by rebel Thomas Paine. And the name of this important essay is Common Sense. Common Sense, written by Thomas Paine, is basically going to be either read or read to every single colonist. Back in this day and age, important documents like this, people that could read would obviously read them, but a lot of people could not read. There was no public education. So people would stand in village greens or like in Boston Commons and read it out loud to crowds who could not read. So there are some basic things argued for in Common Sense by Thomas Paine that's really going to gain support for the rebellion among colonists and get a lot of these quote-unquote undecided voters to jump off the fence on the side of the rebellion. Now, what he basically says in Common Sense is he places the blame of what's going on in the colonies, all these taxes, the Boston Massacre, all the other events we've talked about, firmly on King George III. He basically says he's a tyrant king who doesn't know what he's doing, and the colonists are all paying the price for his poor decisions. That's a pretty brilliant thing to do, because you're really not blaming your home country, you're blaming a person, the tyrant king, King George III. The second thing he talks about in Common Sense is basically he points out that since the Sugar Act, we've been paying and paying and paying as colonists. Tax after tax after tax. So sort of in a common sense way, he says, could we please see the bill? We think we paid you back everything we owe you for the French and Indian War, and you continue to make us pay. We'd like to know what we owe you so we know when you paid you off. So show us the bill, would you? Now, the final thing that Paine talks about in Common Sense is that the 13 British colonies are not just exclusively British anymore. There are plenty of people that live in the colonies from Ireland, Scotland, Germany, and other places. Not to mention British Canada, which is all French settlers. So, we no longer just owe our allegiance to the King of England in England. We are more of a European group of colonies, and that has changed everything. So, Common Sense is a very popular document. It's read to everyone in the colonies, and it's going to be one of the forces behind us being confident enough to declare independence in July of 1776. Now, the next thing I want to do is something I've been waiting a while to do, but this is a good way to sum up where we're going and where we've been at this point. Historians argue that the French and Indian War either directly caused or was a major factor in the American Revolution. And I want to explain to you this line of logic, and it all should make sense now. The French and Indian War, the biggest thing that historians point to is that gigantic debt England incurred. They were in debt up to their eyeballs, and they were looking for someone to pay the debt for them. So what'd they do? Hand the bill to the colonists. The British point of view was, we benefited the most. We no longer have this enemy, the French, lurking over our shoulders. We're now free from war, and we're the benefactors of the French and Indian War. So we should pay for the majority of it. Whether that's true or not, doesn't matter. The second thing that historians point to is the Albany Congress Albany Plan that took place preparing for the French and Indian War, that meeting called by William Pitt. When the colonists all gathered there, it was the first time that they looked at things from a colonial-wide perspective. Remember parts of the plan. They wanted to have a centralized group to negotiate with Native American tribes. They wanted a colonial-wide army led by colonists and paid for colonists with a colonial-wide tax. Never before had colonists looked at things from this perspective. It was always a colony-by-colony perspective. What was good for New York came first. What was good for Virginia came first. No one thought what was good for all the colonies. They first started thinking about this. This created a blueprint for the Continental Congress, the Stamp Act Congress, and the Continental Army. Really, this is what led to that. So, the other thing that historians point to is the only thing that the British salvaged from the Albany Plan Congress was they took a select group of colonists and trained them as British officers in British training school in England. One of those officers was George Washington. He then gained his military experience in the French and Indian War, but it was pretty nice of the British to train the commander of the Continental Army, George Washington, and he was trained with their own playbook, so to speak. He knew all the British strategies, and so did some of his key generals who were also part of this elite corps. So they could anticipate what the British were going to do on the battlefield because they were trained in the same strategy. And the British Army isn't going to abandon age-old strategies just because a handful of colonists know about it. They were too cocky to do that. So, the huge debt, the Albany Plan in Congress, and training of George Washington and others really led to the American Revolution. Then something that happened by coincidence also occurs during the French and Indian War. What I want to remind you of is King George II dies. King George III takes over as king then. And we all know what a childish fool he was. So, he will be the tyrant during the Rev War and during all these taxes. All these things occur as a result of the French and Indian War. So, that's the end of this particular lecture, class. When we pick up next, we're going to talk about the American Revolution right in our own backyard, including the Battle of Valcour, Saratoga, and other very important events that happened right here in the North Country. And we're also going to key in on somebody who was an outstanding hero who later turned traitor, Benedict Arnold. So that's it for this lecture. Take care. Everyone be safe and stay home. Bye now.